I'm going to talk about Juliet, a character from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. These are just a few ideas of some aspects of a character that you could explore should Juliet come up in an upcoming exam. So if you get a character question, my advice is to always start with your initial impression of that character, because it enables you to talk about how their character develops or doesn't develop over the course of the play. So initially, she is presented as a young, innocent, dutiful daughter. So we first hear about Juliet through her father, Lord Capulet, in Act 1, Scene 2, where he describes her as a stranger in the world. He's speaking to Paris at this point. Paris is asking for her hand in marriage. So our attention is immediately drawn to her young age, which is 13, and we see her as this inexperienced, naive girl. Think about later on when we watch her fall in love with Romeo. Does that young age affect the way we look at that? Are we sceptical because she is so young and inexperienced? Do we look at this relationship and think, well, no, this is just a first crush. She's never experienced love before, and therefore she thinks it's more than it actually is. That's one way of looking at her relationship with Romeo. She refers to her mother as Madam in Act 1, Scene 3 when we first meet her. So that formal language reveals that she is a respectful child, but it also hints at the fact that her and her mother have quite a distant relationship, which was quite normal for those times for a daughter of a wealthy family. But that could explain why in the end she is so rebellious, and that she doesn't have that, or at least this sense of duty doesn't stay with her for the course of the play, considering the fact that she's not actually that close to her parents. That's one way of explaining her actions. When asked by her mother what she thinks about getting married, she says it's an honour that I dream not of. So again, this helps emphasise her youth. And I know you might be thinking, well, hold on, she's 13, of course she's not thinking about marriage. Please bear in mind, in the Elizabethan times, you could get married if you were a girl as young as 12. It wasn't actually that common, but it was legal. So, you know, this would, for the audience at the time, emphasise that she is a young 13. So ask yourself, when she meets Romeo, considering the fact that she hasn't even thought about marriage and it's not something that she's looking for, does that actually make you take their relationship more seriously? Unlike Romeo, who seems to almost be in love with being in love, because we see him at the beginning, you know, moaning about Rosaline. He seems to be a character who enjoys being in a relationship, but Juliet is someone who's never really even thought about it. So might you argue therefore that her love is more authentic than Romeo's? That's one way of arguing it again. So the important thing to get those high marks is you want to be exploring these alternative interpretations of a character. You don't need to just stick to one idea. And then when she's asked, what do you think about this wonderful man, this handsome, rich man called Paris? She says, no more deep will line dart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly. So she's basically saying, I won't love him any more than you want me to. So that's how dutiful a daughter she is, that she's saying, I will control my emotions to the extent that you want me to. So she is being quite practical about love. She thinks she can control her emotions, and some might argue that's quite a naive perspective on love, and again highlights her inexperience. She clearly has never fallen in love before. But think about, in terms of structure, we're going to see her sense of duty to her parents very quickly discarded when she meets Romeo. So I think what's important here is we could have started this play at a different point. We could have started this when she meets Romeo, and we would have just seen her as a rebellious teenager who goes against the wishes of her parents, is flirting with a boy, and we'll talk about kind of the expectations of Elizabethan girls at the time, but you know, that wouldn't be really acceptable behaviour. But I think it's really important that Shakespeare has established her as this dutiful, obedient character at the beginning, because what we're about to see when she meets Romeo, we realise is out of character for Juliet. She's not a particularly rebellious character. So again, does that make us think, well, she must have really felt something for him for there to be such a drastic change in her character from this very dutiful daughter to someone who's really quite rebellious and discards that sense of duty. So thinking about context to kind of explain the way she is at this point, or at least the way she's perceived. So daughters of respectable families, and basically we're talking about wealthy families in the Elizabethan times, would expect their fathers to be very much involved in choosing a husband. And this is because girls were really seen as commodities at this point, okay? Marriages were seen as a chance to form really useful alliances, to maintain the social status of their daughter, their financial security. Girls would be married off with a dowry. So it was really important for the head of the household, the man, the father, to make sure that there was an alliance that they could benefit from. Girls of wealthy families would lead very sheltered lives, and typically they would stay mostly at home, okay? They would learn domestic skills. They might be educated, they might be homeschooled, but they were really being prepared to be a wife. There weren't really any other opportunities for them, hence Juliet's inexperience. Children, especially girls, were expected to be as obedient to their parents as a servant to their master, so that explains the way she speaks to her mother, and also that distant relationship between her and her parents. And it's really important to understand that there wasn't any concept of adolescence at this time. There wasn't such thing as a teenager. You were a child one minute and overnight you became an adult during these times. So it's really easy to look at Juliet so young and go, there's no way she could have fallen in love with Romeo. She's too young, she's too naive, she's too inexperienced. But actually, in these days and these times, she would have become an adult overnight when she married Paris instead. So this isn't really out of the ordinary to see such an abrupt change in Juliet. People would have seen that with many children turning to kind of adulthood overnight. You could definitely, when she meets Romeo, note that she seems very spiritual. So she calls him God of my idolatry and my Lord. The religious language depicts a relationship that's sacred, that's much deeper than this transactional marriage that you've seen from her father and her mother. She describes her love. My bounty is as boundless as the sea. The simile highlights how, like the sea, Juliet's love has no boundaries. The alliteration, the b sound, and the assonance, which is the ow sound, bounty, boundless, draw attention to the depth of her love. So when she is describing her love, it's always about the depth of it, the extent of it. So her, unlike Romeo at the beginning, when he's kind of saying things like heavy lightness, serious vanity, if you break those words down, they actually mean nothing. So Romeo just really talks a load of rubbish, if I'm being completely honest, at least from my perspective, and just likes the idea of love. But her words have meaning behind them, and so she appears to be much more spiritual in contrast to Romeo, who's full of cliches. More rich in matter than in words, brags of his substance, not of ornament. So here, this is at the wedding. She's basically saying that she's developed such strong feelings for Romeo that she cannot explain them in words. So what we're noticing here now, that she no longer can adhere to the courtly tradition, and the courtly tradition would have been to kind of explain in poetic ways your love to your husband or wife, or future husband, future wife. She's now kind of transcended that. She's gone above and beyond the traditions, the scopes of society. The adjective rich here emphasizes the complexity and the depth of her love for Romeo. And then think about initially what we saw from Lady Capulet and the nurse in Act 1, Scene 3. We have Lady Capulet tell Juliet to read over the volume of Paris's face, so look at his face and decide whether you love him. And then the nurse says, by having him, making yourself no less. So if you marry him, you won't go down the social ladder. Your financial wealth will be the same. It won't decrease, okay? So The profundity of Juliet's love contrasts with Lady Capulet's and Nurse's shallow and pragmatic approach to love. So looking at these quotations, you could very easily argue, you know what, Juliet's love is real, and it's on this incredibly deep scale that you might argue doesn't belong to the world that she's in or the society that she's in. And maybe that's her downfall, that this spiritual love doesn't really belong in the restraints of the society with which she lives in. But we can critically analyse this as well. You could be quite sceptical. So you could look at, for instance, the fact that Juliet is often described as a metaphorical light by Romeo. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. Juliet is the sun. So she's this symbol of light, and that's supposed to portray Juliet as a source of warmth and happiness for Romeo. What you might think about is how light is strengthened by darkness. Okay, so is it because, and you might say the darkness is a symbol of Romeo's depressive state, because remember, he's heartbroken. So does Juliet look more beautiful? Does she seem more attractive to him? Does she make him feel particularly happy because he is so sad? So has his kind of depressed state exaggerated in his mind how special she is to him? You could look at darkness not just as a symbol of Romeo's depressive state, but maybe a symbol of the secretive nature of that relationship. And again, does that the secretive nature, the forbidden nature of this relationship, does that intensify their feelings for one another? Just like darkness intensifies light, the secretive nature, the forbidden nature of this relationship intensifies their love. So you could question, would they feel as strongly for one another if their relationship wasn't forbidden? Would Romeo have responded to Juliet in the way that he did if he wasn't so depressed and was really looking desperately for love or a distraction? It is a horribly skeptical way of looking at their relationship, but it is logical. You can definitely argue that, and even if you don't agree with that, raise it as a possible interpretation. So looking at the context, some things to keep in mind. The Elizabethan society was very religious, so when Juliet is attributing godlike qualities to Romeo as an example, referring to him as Lord, they would have seen this as blasphemous, and they would have seen this really as reckless behaviour. There is no one that you should hold with such on such a high pedestal other than God. And so this would create tension amongst the audience, because they think nothing good can come out of this type of violent love, this intense love. Marriages between wealthy people were very pragmatic. It was important to know what resources each partner would provide, and we haven't seen that with Romeo and Juliet. They've just fallen in love instantly. And so we're in a society where less emphasis was placed on love. Again, the audience might look at this and go, this is really foolish. They haven't thought this through. This will never work. This will never create an alliance that will benefit either family. Remember, that's the way wealthy Elizabethans might look at marriage. So again, if you're a member of that audience of those times, you're looking at this going, this is just a disaster waiting to happen. What on earth are they thinking? There was also a common proverb at the time, which was hot love is soon cold. So this idea that passionate love was actually a really unsafe basis for marriage, according to the Elizabethans. We should be much more modest and reserved in matters of love. So again, of course, this is all foreshadowing, isn't it? It's suggesting that this spiritual type of love, this intense type of love, is unsafe. It's dangerous. Okay, she's really bold as well. When she kisses Romeo, and well, to begin with, the fact that they kiss when they first meet, that's really bold. Might be normal now, not in the Elizabethan times, okay? You wouldn't potentially kiss until you got married. As a girl, that is. It might be a bit different for boys. So even that is bold. But the fact that she comments on his kiss afterwards as well. Now, there are typically two schools of thought of what she's saying here by "you kiss by the book." She's either complimenting him by saying that's like the perfect kiss, or she's criticizing it, saying it's like you read in a manual how to kiss. It's a cliched kiss. But either way, she is being direct. She's commenting on the way he kisses. The girl was supposed to be coy. So that makes her quite a bold character. At the balcony scene, Act 2, Scene 2, she says to Romeo, "If thou dost love, pronounce it faithfully." Look at the imperative, pronounce. Okay, she's challenging Romeo's sincerity. She's not just holding back and waiting to see what he says, and she's not just taking what he says, because he's saying wonderful cliched things to her. But she's very direct. No, if you love me, just pronounce it faithfully. And that word again, faithfully, this idea that her type of love is spiritual, it's much deeper than these kind of surface level cliche bits of poetry that Romeo kind of offers her. When her father says, you're going to have to marry Paris, it'll cheer everyone up, including yourself, over the death of Tybalt, she says quite simply, "I won't marry." So the declarative sentence there reflects her defiance. Obviously this contrast to the way she was at the beginning. Remember, "I'll love Paris to the extent that you want me to." Now she's incredibly defiant, but remember, obviously she's married at this point to Romeo. You might even go further and say this actually contrasts to Tybalt, who backed down from Lord Capulet at the party. If you remember, he wanted to have a bit of a fight with Romeo when he spotted that he was at the party. So, she's been much bolder, much braver than a male character, and we'll come to that in a minute, why that's important. She doesn't give in to her father's demands. She's the antithesis of her character at the beginning, someone who was totally obedient, who is now directly defying her father's wishes. When she goes to Friar Lawrence for help, basically saying, "There's no way I'm marrying Paris. I'd rather be chained to roaring bears." Okay, this hyperbolic language, and this is this is just one example of many from that monologue. It defies traditional expectations of her gender by showing great courage. She's saying she's willing to do anything, and we'll come to this in a moment for context, but women weren't expected to be the courageous kind. That being fearful, for instance, was considered womanish, and actually Friar Lawrence says something like that just before she's going to fake her death. He says basically, you can't have any womanish fear, otherwise this won't work. And then right at the end, she kills herself, doesn't she? When she finds Romeo, she stabs herself, and just before she says, "Oh, happy dagger." So the interjection, that being "oh," and the exclamation express her heightened emotions and her willingness to die. She's resolute at this point. Her suicide contrasts to Romeo. Romeo takes poison and dies very quickly. You might argue it's a bit more cowardly than stabbing yourself. That's more painful, it's more violent. And the fact that it is more violent paints her as actually a bit more of a masculine character, which is in contrast to Romeo, who's often quite an effeminate character, always talking about his emotions and being quite impulsive. Critical analysis, however, is it bold or is it reckless? You could certainly read all of these pieces of evidence and go, no, this is just absolute foolish behaviour. Even to flirt and kiss with Romeo as soon as they meet in Act 1, Scene 5 demonstrates Juliet's impulsivity, as she knows she's supposed to be giving Paris a chance at this party, the man her parents want her to marry. For an Elizabethan audience, they would say this is absolutely reckless behaviour. She should be respecting what her parents want. They are more experienced than she is. They understand the world and how it works much better than she does. She's being naive and thinking that love is enough. It's not going to be. Okay, it's going to lead to their death. She even notices that she's being a bit too bold. Okay, it is too rash, too unadvised, too sudden. This is again the balcony scene. The triplets draw attention to Juliet's description of the impulsiveness of their actions. The repetition of two stresses their extreme behaviour. Despite this acknowledgement, she shortly proposes marriage. So again, you could say, look, she even knows that this is reckless, but she still continues with it. And again, is this just a silly 13-year-old girl, inexperienced, who's getting carried away with her first crush. Thinking about context, Elizabethan women were expected to follow a man's lead, be it their father or their husband, depending on their situation. And she often kind of takes the lead. She proposes marriage. She puts Romeo on the spot by saying, "Tell me whether you love me, and be faithful about it." She takes the lead in killing herself in the end. And we've already talked about this. Fear was seen as a womanish emotion, so at times Juliet appears quite masculine. Also, don't forget that suicide was considered a mortal sin by the Elizabethans. You might argue that Shakespeare sets suicides in a number of plays, this one being set in Italy. So he sets these suicides in distant countries so that the English audience that would be watching it in the late 1500s, early 1600s, they wouldn't feel that discomfort that they normally would when talking about a taboo subject like suicide. There wasn't actually a word for suicide when Shakespeare wrote this play. They would call it self-murder, and if you failed at suicide, you would be arrested and you would be tried as a criminal. So that's how strongly they felt about suicide. Okay, so she's also intelligent, and I think it is important to highlight this, that there's a rational thinker in Juliet. She might not always be rational, and you might argue she gets carried away, but there are moments when we do see this level of intelligence, this level of wit, and I think it's important not just to dismiss her relationship with Romeo as a silly crush. You can overall argue that, but there are elements to Juliet where she understands what she's doing and the complexity of it, but she's going to do it anyway. So first of all, when she speaks with Romeo at the party scene, Act 1, Scene 5, they form a sonnet when they first speak. So immediately, she's presented as Romeo's equal mentally. They're very witty, they go back and forth, and she can handle that. So she's seen as equally as intelligent and as a man, and you might argue that the Elizabethans didn't really look at women and men as intelligently on the same scale. Just before Romeo approaches her on the balcony, she starts to wonder about what's the importance of names. She's just realised that Romeo is a Montague, and she's saying, what's in a name? Why does it matter? So she's actually questioning here, not just what's in his name specifically, but just in general, really questioning this generational feud between the Montagues and the Capulets. She's not blindly subscribing to her family's beliefs, her family's feud. So there's an element of intelligence there. She's not just going along with what she's been told to do. I'm not just hating someone for the sake of it. She's questioning, well, what's the point in this whole feud? Who cares? This is dramatic irony, though, because you could argue this does show that she's naive. She's underestimating the power of a name, especially in this context. Romeo's name will bring violence, it will bring conflict, and eventually it brings their deaths. So actually there's a lot to a name in this context. My husband lives that Tybalt would have slain. So when she finds out that Romeo has killed Tybalt, initially she has an outburst and she's really angry and she questions Romeo as a person, as a decent person. But she very quickly changes and starts to rationalise. Okay, she starts going, well, hold on, if he didn't kill Tybalt, Tybalt would have killed him. So she's rationalising this tragic turning point, and that contrasts greatly with Romeo. If you recall, in the next scene, Act 3, Scene 3, he goes to see Friar Lawrence, and he's screaming and crying and throwing a tantrum on the floor, and he even tries to kill himself. He's not even thinking about Juliet at that point. He's just in complete hysteria. She's seen as the rational, controlled one. Again, much more like a masculine character, in contrast to Romeo's depicted as an effeminate character in the following scene. No man like he doth grieve my heart. So this is, I love when Juliet does this. So she's speaking to her mother, and her mother thinks she's really upset over Tybalt's death, but she's not. She's upset about Romeo being banished. So what she does is she talks to her mother, and she doesn't want to be dishonest. So she's speaking truthfully about Romeo, that no man, in other words, Romeo, like Romeo, does grieve my heart. She's talking about Romeo. But Lady Capulet thinks she's talking about how upset she is that Tybalt is dead. She does it again with Paris, but she bumps into Paris before going to see Friar Lawrence in Act 4, Scene 1. Paris says something about her face, and she says it's not my own. And he thinks she's saying, well, my face belongs to you now because we're about to get married. But she's actually saying it belongs to Romeo. So she skillfully uses double entendre, so in other words, something that has two meanings, to outwit her mother and Paris, to appear truthful while actually being deceitful. So she is really cunning. So please don't dismiss Juliet as just a silly character who gets carried away. She has a level of intelligence which suggests that actually she did understand what she was getting herself into, and she was willing to take all those risks for love. So just a few things. I feel like otherwise, the context I'm not talking about too much now, because I feel like otherwise I'm going to be repeating what I've already said. But just to bear in mind, a child was expected to unquestioningly accept their parents' beliefs, okay? This is the whole point of being obedient to one's parents. And so the fact that she starts to question this feud would be most unusual. Women were believed to be led by their emotions rather than their minds. It was men who were supposed to be led by their minds. So Shakespeare's created two interesting characters, really, that the audience would watch and go, well, this is kind of against the norm. This goes against kind of the social grain. Okay, she's also incredibly loyal. Not too many quotes here, just two. And follow thee, my lord, throughout the world. That's Act 2, Scene 2, where she professes her love and her commitment to Romeo. Again, you could say this shows how bold she is as well. The religious language again highlights her unwavering devotion to Romeo, like you might have unwavering devotion to a god. When the nurse criticises Romeo, it actually acts as a catalyst for Juliet's loyalty. And it creates a distance between her and the nurse. So her loyalty for Romeo grows, and therefore her distance between her and her nurse. And we know that the nurse is much more much closer to her than her mother. That the distance becomes greater. So thou and my bosom henceforth shall be twain. So in other words, you and my heart will be separated. So she's not going to let nurse into all her deep secrets anymore. And we'll see that because she's going to fake her death, and the nurse will be none the wiser. And the reason why is because once married, a woman's loyalty belonged wholly to her husband. So, initially we've seen a very dutiful daughter who obeyed her parents, but that would be transferred to Romeo now that she's married. She's in an impossible situation when she's asked to marry Paris, because her parents don't know that she's married, so the expectation is that she should be completely obedient to them. But actually, the society with which she lives would expect her to be completely loyal to her husband, and they certainly wouldn't expect her to marry two men. She, like Romeo, is a victim of fate. So in the prologue delivered by the chorus, they are described as star-crossed lovers and their love as death marked. So this indicates that their love is really doomed from the start. So you could argue it doesn't matter what Juliet does, how bold she is, how reckless she is. This was inevitable. It was going to happen. The nurse describes her as a lamb at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 3. So she's a symbol. That's a symbol of sacrifice, and that foreshadows her tragic end. Her life is sacrificed for the two families to realise the error in their ways and come together. That's one way of looking at it. This was God's purpose. This was God's plan. They were always supposed to die to end the feud. She asks, can heaven be so envious? So this is when she learns of Romeo's banishment. The celestial imagery here demonstrates the power of fate. She does believe that fate is controlling what happens in their relationship. And she's saying, God, were you so envious at the depth of our love that you're going to destroy it? And And interestingly, when she speaks to Paris, and Paris is saying, oh, we're going to get married on Thursday, see ya. He doesn't say it like that, obviously. But she says, what must be shall be. And it's dramatic irony, really, because she doesn't want to say, yes, see you Thursday. She's just saying, yes, what will be, will be. Because in her head, she's like, well, no, I'm not going to marry you. I'm going to sort something out with Friar Lawrence and get out of this. But it's dramatic irony because we know, yeah, what must be shall be, Juliet, and what must be is that you're going to die. You are going to be, your life will be sacrificed so that your parents can get over this feud. So there is this sense of tragic inevitability in that dialogue. So remember that Elizabethans really believed in predetermined fate and would likely view a Romeo and Juliet's tragic end as inescapable. So really it doesn't matter whether she's bold or reckless or whatever. They were always going to die. That was God's plan. Or the stars' plan. You could think about this whole character and think about an overall message of her being a victim of patriarchy, and had she not lived in a patriarchal society, then she would never have had this tragic end. Look at how Lord Capulet speaks to her when she says she doesn't want to marry Paris. He refers to her as you baggage. The metaphor objectifies Juliet and really highlights her as a burden on her father, and that really links to how girls would have been seen if they're not married by a certain time, because they would be dependent on their father financially. They would become a burden if they weren't married. So you really get that from that dialogue, that he's basically saying you are such a weight, you are such a burden. He threatens her by saying, hang, beg, starve, die in the streets. In other words, if you don't marry Paris, I'm going to leave you to hang, beg, starve, die. This lexical field of suffering highlights the vulnerability of Juliet and women at this time. Her welfare depends on her obedience to her father. He has the power to cut all funds and leave her on the streets. If all else fails, myself have power to die. So after all of that, these threats from Lord Capulet, Juliet searches for the one bit of power she still has, and that's power over her own life. You might say it's a paradoxical statement because it reveals how the patriarchal restraints on Juliet confine her to limited options. So she talks about power, but she has such little power, but she's just focusing on that one bit of power, which is that she can still die. And those limited options are she can marry Paris or kill herself, and she chooses the latter. So she chooses to take control of her destiny in the limited way she can. So the argument here would be, had she not lived in a patriarchal society, she would have had more options open to her other than marrying Paris or killing herself. So some things to think about in terms of the reaction of her father. Her father would have seen it as his duty to protect her social status and her financial security. And the only way to fulfill this would be to find a suitor of appropriate status and sufficient wealth, that being Paris in this instance. So that would be, I'm not saying it's fine for the way that he responded to her, but that's why he gets so frustrated, because he has this sense of duty. He has this obligation that he must fulfill as a father, and she's getting in the way of it. That's the way he would see it. I've already talked about women being financially dependent on men, and that's why that's kind of came hand in hand therefore with their obedience. They had no choice but to be obedient because they depended on them. And that just talks about obedience as well. Okay, so one thing to think about is Shakespeare's message through the character of Juliet. Is he actually holding her up in high esteem and saying, look at this incredible female character who is equal in importance to Romeo in their relationship? She matches him mentally. She has this incredible concept of love. She's so spiritual. It transcends anything that this society is really used to in terms of love. Is he holding her up in high esteem? That is one way certainly of looking at it. And remember, at this time we have a female monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. And so, was he thinking of Queen Elizabeth at this point as well, thinking what she would want to see on stage, this impressive, strong-willed, independent woman? But I think it's important also to think about the source from which Shakespeare got this inspiration from. So before this play was written, there was a poem about Romeo and Juliet by Arthur Brooke. And in his foreword, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he basically says that this is what happens when you have this dishonest desire, and especially you neglect your duty to your parents and friends. This is what happens when you don't listen to the people around you. This is what happens when you marry to hide actually how awful your actions are. So he's actually saying it's their fault. And so that's quite interesting that Shakespeare drew his inspiration from this. This isn't to say that Shakespeare read this forward and went, yeah, I agree with Arthur Brooke, but you could raise it, especially as a link to context, and say, look, Arthur Brooke, whom Shakespeare gained his inspiration from his poem, actually says in his foreword, you know, it's their fault. They should have behaved properly. They shouldn't have been going to superstitious friars. They shouldn't have been so adventurous, and they should have listened and obeyed their parents. So that's one way of thinking about it. So just remember, whatever question comes up or however it's worded, you do want to think about why Shakespeare used that character. What is the bigger message about Juliet? And that could be one of it. Is she used as a cautionary tale? Okay, look what happens when you are so bold, when you love so violently. As always, I would love to hear your own thoughts. By no means have I included absolutely everything about Juliet, because that would take forever and a day. So I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section as well.